welcome back to my channel. Bonjour et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and first of all, a happy new year to all of you. In this video, I will be doing my 2021 reading wrap-up. What that means practically is that I'm going to take a look back at my reading year, go through my favourite reads of 2021, my least favourite reads, and whichever book I found noteworthy enough to mention here. Basically. So I'm going to start with the non-fiction I read in 2021. I must have read, if I include the graphic publications, because yes, I'm tossing in graphic non-fiction with the non-fiction, I must have read between 10 and 20 titles of non-fiction. It basically corresponds to my general average. It tended to cluster around the big subject poles of feminism, the natural sciences / medicine, and psychology, specific bits of history, things like that. So first I'm going to mention 4 books which really stood out to me as the best of what I read in non-fiction this year. There was La Culture du Viol, written by Noémie Renard, which is now the best thing I've ever read about the subject of rape culture. It's an absolutely amazing and near perfect, as far as I'm concerned, synthesis and analysis of that specific subtopic within, broadly speaking, feminism. The second best thing I read this year was also about, broadly speaking, feminism, specifically about the manosphere. It was Men Who Hate Women, written by Laura Bates, and I mean I didn't really learn much of anything new because I was already pretty well versed in that subject, but it takes a deep dive into what is the manosphere, its different components, linking it back to broader issues of sexism, rape culture, etc., etc. You get the gist. I thought the topic was laid out in a very understandable and accessible fashion. I also found a couple of the things Laura Bates said about feminicide and sexism-based terrorism quite interesting, and they echoed some things I've heard from French language feminists. Adjacently linked to feminism, I read 2 excellent books about the conflict between feminist activism and trans rights activism, which is a very hot button topic these days. Those 2 books would be Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, written by Professor Kathleen, and Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality, written by Helen, Joyce. The first book takes a more philosophy-based approach to the subject of gender identity specifically, though it does give general information about this topic as well. Trans When Ideology Meets Reality is a broader exploration of this topic. It really goes through all the ramifications of this activism conflict, of this theoretical conflict. So for complete noobs to this subject, I would probably point them first towards this latter book, though I would also very, very highly recommend Material Girls. Both together are great pieces of gender-critical, analytical, non-fiction writing. And I'll mention 2 books which weren't necessarily absolute favorites, but I found them very interesting and or enjoyable. So I read L'Enfant Interdit, written by Pierre Verdrager, and this is very thorough. Well, not so much historical, more sociological analysis of the pro-pedophilia movement of the 1970s and 80s, in France specifically, though he does touch upon the sister movements in other countries of the West. It was fascinating, repulsive, and eye-opening because there's some things happening today that I feel echo what happened with that back in the 1970s and 80s. I also read Sexus, Animalus. This one was just more fun overall. It's a book about non-human animal sexuality. Really, though, it's more about sexual anatomy of non-human animals, the very wide variety of penises, clitorides, vaginas that exist in nature, and the wide variety of pretty disturbing and creepy mating behaviors that exist in nature. And also nicer ones that I mentioned towards the end of the book, so, you know, it balances out ultimately. But yes, it was an interesting read. I do have to mention the very worst thing I read in 2021 in terms of non-fiction, and that was Entangled Live by Merlin Sheldrake. Oh wow, that book pissed me off so much I actually threw it across my bedroom. Yes, it was that level of annoyingly, what the fuck am I reading right now? It was a hot mess. It was all over the place. There was too much philosophizing, or pseudo-philosophizing, too much injecting of woo-woo spirituality, which should have been reserved for end-of-your-thesis speculation, not just spread out throughout the book, never taking the time to actually define what a fungal organism is, not going through the basics of mycology. I did enjoy the chapter about mycoremediation. I wish there'd been more of that. But so yeah, massive disappointment. Like, what the hell? I shall have to find another book to satisfy my shroom enthusiast cravings. And finally, in the area of graphic non-fiction, I read L'incroyable histoire de la littérature. So this is a volume of graphic non-fiction about French literature specifically, and it felt like being back in school. Most of that would be horrific to me, but I did enjoy my literature classes. So I had this wonderful refresher about French literature, learning about a lot of the big authors and their major works, and I read Culottées volumes 1 and 2. This is just a collection of biographical vignettes about very interesting female figures from history, but figures which might be less well known by the general public and led interesting, quirky, different lives and might have contributed something interesting to the rest of society or just lived out their eccentric selves, and by virtue of that were quite inspiring. So I really enjoyed those 2 volumes, and I would definitely highly recommend them as well. Quickly though, before I move on to the graphic fiction category, I forgot to mention my favorite memoir of this past year. It was Darkness Visible, written by William Styron. This memoir is very short, it's about 80 pages long, talks about the author's experience of debilitating, severe, acute depression. And I found a lot of things in there to relate to. He puts words on what it feels like to live through that I'd never seen said by anyone else, but which just hit me in the heart. I was glad to have these words I could then use myself to talk about severe depression. Now, my depression is more chronic than acute. He just had this one massive depressive episode and went into remission. Lucky for him, really. Right, now moving on to the graphic fiction I read in 2021. First, I'll go through the series I read/continued with. So at the beginning of the year, I continued on with the remaining thus far published volumes of Saga. I'm really enjoying Saga so far, and apparently we're getting the continuation next year, so yay. I also continued on with Monstrous. That is also easily one of my favorite graphic novel series of all time at this point, and we got volume 6 this year. Hopefully we'll get volume 7 next year. I also read through the entirety of Lock and Key, so that's made up of 6 main volumes. I did read them in French. I thought it really was going to be heavier on the horror. There are little winks and nods to Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and I was like, nice. But the pacing and storytelling was very uneven from one volume to another. I'm not a huge fan of stories that center on children either, but it was enjoyable enough. Now, the very best of the best I read this year, 2 graphic novels, well, I guess technically they were graphic memoirs. Oops, my bad. 2 graphic memoirs about sexual abuse, sexual trauma. There was Speak, the graphic novel, written by Laurie Halse Anderson and illustrated by Emily Carroll, and Becoming, Unbecoming, written and illustrated by Una. I, in fact, did a dual review for both of these if you're interested. So Speak, the graphic novel, is about this 13-year-old's experience of having been raped and what happens to her after that, how she deals with it or doesn't deal with it. Becoming Unbecoming also talks about the author's experience of sexual violence. It also takes a look at the case of the Yorkshire Ripper in the 1970s, I believe, and just injects as well bits of feminist theory about rape culture, about sexual violence, and how women experience it. So I would highly recommend both of them, though if I had to choose between the 2, I would go for Becoming Unbecoming first and foremost. I also read a biographical graphic novel about famed French poet Charles Baudelaire called Mademoiselle Baudelaire, written and illustrated by Hilaire, and it was brilliant. It really goes through the history of this author, and specifically his relationship to his muse and lover Jeanne Duval, who was a mixed-raced woman, so that was pretty unusual for the time. It was a very dark, intense, passionate relationship, but then the author himself was a pretty dark, passionate in the negative sense of the word, an intense person, an interesting personality, so a very good graphic novel. And finally, the third best thing I read this year was Le Plaisir, written and illustrated by Maria Hesse. This was more of an art book, I suppose, written by a Spanish artist. It talks about her experience of female sexuality and pleasure and learning to understand and appreciate appreciate her body and appreciate sexuality and lovemaking and things like that. And then she draws parallels to female archetypes or female historical figures. It was very pretty, elegant, poetic, delicate, sensitive, and I read that exactly at the right time in my life for personal reasons, so I very strongly vibe with it. Now moving on to the meat of this video, which will be the fiction, good old novels. So I'm going to start with a few books I found interesting, which I think are worthwhile mentioning here. They weren't absolute favorites, they weren't absolute disappointments. I read Small Gods, written by Terry Pratchett. I did a standalone review for this book. I had a good laugh going through it. I'm not in a rush to read anything else in the Discworld, but I had a good time. I read this on the psych ward. It was a good time to read it, I guess. And I've now read at least one Terry Pratchett book. I did read The Murders in the Rue Morgue and Other Stories by Edgar Allan Poe. It's the first collection of Edgar Allan Poe fiction I've ever read, and it was enjoyable enough, I guess. I mean, I expected something more, I suppose. Expected more supernatural stuff, more creep, more horror. Maybe not horror specifically, but yeah, more creepiness. I also read I'm Thinking of Ending Things, written by Ian Reid, and that is a psychological thriller, which is definitely one of the genres I read the least out of. But it was quite good. The ending of it wasn't quite as mind-blowing as I was hoping it would be, but it worked, basically. I kind of guessed it, which, I don't know, I guess good on me for being astute enough, but at the same time I was like, but I kind of saw it coming. I also read The Book of the Unnamed Midwife. Now, technically could go into the best of 2021, but now I'm less sure about my feelings regarding it, because I also read it when I was in a very weird place mentally in the hospital. The Book of the Unnamed Midwife, written by Meg Ellison, was a post-apocalyptic / dystopian tale about a disease which kills a lot of women, and women have a much higher risk of dying in childbirth, and you follow this female bisexual midwife as she tries to survive in America and tries to find remnants of civilization. And I found it very moving and very visceral, but it's also because I was in a very, very weird and bad place. I still think it's a worthwhile story, don't get me wrong. I would recommend it to people who enjoy that genre, most definitely. However, I will not be checking out the other books in this trilogy. I was happy with volume 1, and I know for a fact some elements in further volumes might annoy me. And then I finally read Jurassic Park, written by Michael Crichton. I mean, ultimately, was it really a disappointment? It's just, it wasn't as good as the movie Zombie. But still, dinosaurs. I'm happy I read it. I did a review for the book, and I mentioned the movie quite a bit as well. I do basically compare the two in it, if you want to check that out. A greater disappointment to me, though, again, was it really? I just didn't really know what to expect going in. Was Piranesi, written by Susanna Clarke. The base, world-building, premise, setup was neat. Interesting enough, but then I thought it didn't really go anywhere that interesting. Ultimately, the plot was fine. The characters were forgettable. The whole thing is really fairly forgettable to me, apart from that base setup. It hasn't put me off Susanna Clarke, however, because I will be reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell next year, so hopefully that will work much better for me. And finally, I will mention the fact that I finished out the trilogy of H.P. Lovecraft fiction anthologies edited by S.T. Joshi this year. I read The Thing on the Doorstep and Other Stories in February, I think, and then I read The Dreams in the Witch House and Other Weird Stories in October. It's good old H.P. Lovecraft. Good old reliable is what I'm calling it from now on. Big, oozy monsters, cosmic horror, what the fucky weird fiction elements, cats battling eldritch horrors. Respect. So I'm happy I have the 3 of them in my library now, and I can dip into them whenever I feel like it in the future. I also rounded out my exploration of the Tolkien verse by reading through Beren and Luthien and The Fall of Gondolin, which are not standalone stories from the Elder Days. They are walkings through the development of those tales, with different versions being presented and analysed by J.R.R. Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien. I'm happy I read them, though I would have enjoyed a Children of Hurin treatment, obviously, like everyone else. Alas, now I must mention the worst of the worst of 2021. Thankfully, there weren't too many of them either. First, I must mention one of the top worst reads of 2021, and that was Semiosis, written by Sue Burke. I did a rant review for that novel. It's actually the only real rant review I did this year, so just one. yay for me. I was so freaking disappointed. I was hoping for something a la Children of Time with plants, and that's not at all what I got. And then the second worst thing I read this year was Trust Exercise, written by Susan Choi. So this was a spur-of-the-moment borrow from the library. It's literary fiction. I was under the impression it was going to be somewhat about sexual abuse, the Me Too movement. It might be in a very tangential way. I mean, I don't know. It was weird. It's one of those books that tries to be fancy with its structure, and it's a story within a story within a story, and characters are not who they say they are, and then you shift perspectives and you don't really know what's going on, and it was like, whoopee freaking do. What am I supposed to make of this? I mean, I just found it pretentious. Pretentious twaddle, I think, is what I qualified it as in my Goodreads review. It's just like, stop, okay? I also read Vita Nostra, written by Marina and Sergei Dyachenko. This is a novel translated from the Russian, as the authors are Ukrainian. Not quite as bad as Semiosis or Trust Exercise, but just like, okay, whatever. It also tries to do this playing around with not so much linguistic relativity as such, but just language modifying reality and people being words and grammatical concepts and unlocking magic through rewriting reality, but you never get a concrete explanation as how one does that. The main character was whatever, the side characters were whatever, I didn't care about anyone, anything that was happening, and by the end I was like, okay, I kind of see what you're trying to do there, and I'm not impressed, I'm bored, I want to be done with this. I also read Little Big, written by John Crowley. So I read 3 fancy masterworks this year. Ombre and Shadow, written by Patricia A. McKillip, which I enjoyed at the beginning of the year. Little Big by John Crowley, and Thomas the Rhymer, written by Ellen Kushner, which was nice enough, but nothing extraordinary. So Little Big, however, was fairly disappointing because I was expecting a story playing around with fairies in that OG sense of being neither good or bad, but these mysterious spirits of nature, and it was just boring. Like, really legitimately boring. I did do a dual review for Little Big and Thomas the Rhymer, if you want to check that out, both being somewhat thematically linked via this theme concept of fairies. And finally, I am brought to the most disappointing series I read this year, the Poppy War trilogy written by Arif Kwan. I read this through most of November, and I did a series review for it if you're interested. Yeah, massively underwhelmed with that one, actively annoyed with books 2 and especially book 3. That conclusion was just somewhat offensive, if I'm being perfectly honest. I was just disappointed by the very superficial theming, the relatively lackluster world building. I hated Rin, and I hated her characterization because I didn't find it convincing. It wasn't convincing, and it was grating on my nerves all of the time. And I couldn't with Rin. But so yes, massive disappointment, and I really desperately need to learn to DNF series which aren't working for me. Note to self. Now I can mention the very best of 2021, and I'm going to do a reverse of what I did for the worst. I'm going to start with the series, or at least start with the duologies. I read the Children of Time and Children of Ruin duology by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I loved it. I did a review for both of them, if you're interested. That was so much fun and so clever and so deliciously rich with its speculative evolutionary biology. Those somewhat alien spiders, those somewhat alien octopuses, yes, give me more of that. It was brilliant. I also read Hyperion and The Fall of Hyperion. So not strictly speaking a duology because it is part of a greater quadrilogy including Endymion and The Rise of Endymion, but I decided I'm not going to check those out because I enjoyed Hyperion so freaking much. I want to stay on that high note. I actually preferred The Fall of Hyperion to Hyperion, but both together just chef's kiss. And of course I did a dual review for both of them as well. I read the Ambergris duology. Technically it's a trilogy, but Finch has been out of print for some reason. I'm going to read Finch in January, so I'll round out the Ambergris trilogy. But so I read City of Saints and Madmen and Shriek and Afterward, written by Jeff Vandermeer, and that was so much fun as well. I, of course, also did a dual review for the first 2 books in that series. It's weird, urban, fantasy, I guess. I mean, not really clear if it's fantasy or science fiction. It doesn't really matter ultimately, but squid, mushrooms, mushroom people, weird things happening, beautiful, rich writing. I love those books. They're really, really good. And still in this vein of weird fiction and that duo of Jeff Vandermeer and China Miéville, well, I read the new Crobuzon/Baslac trilogy written by the latter China Miéville. And that was also a good old time. My favorite of the three was probably Perdido Street Station, then The Scar, then Iron Council. Just these crazy, but oh so imaginative and intelligent concepts, and nightmare moths and cosmic spiders and people being grafted with machine parts as punishment, all of that. Just wow. So yes, I had a lot of fun with that trilogy. I also did a series review for it if you're interested. And finally, a delightful surprise it was to me, the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams. It's definitely now one of my favorite things in the genre fantasy, or I guess technically speaking science fantasy, but I enjoyed the world building. I really freaking enjoyed those characters and the character relationships and the mythological creatures and the sci-fi elements. And all of that was just so brilliantly brought together into one beautiful tapestry of storytelling. I don't know, I really loved it. And of course, here as well, I did the series review for it, a glowing rave series review for it, if you want to check that out. And then I'm going to mention 3 standalones that really stand at the top of what I read this past year. You have Putney, written by Sof Kazanoviev. I read this twice this year, in fact. Putney was very good, but beyond that simple adjective of good, it was just very emotionally impactful and very personal. For me, it's in that same category of stories as My Dark Vanessa is. And I found it especially impactful because it explores the points of view of the victim of grooming and sexual abuse, yes, but it also gives you the point of view of the predator, and then a third point of view, the best friend of the victim, and explores memory and how you construct your understanding of your life history and the complicated feelings that are entangled with having been groomed, having been in love with your abuser, with your predator, which My Dark Vanessa addresses as well. But Putney, I don't know, there was an additional dimension to it, which means I prefer it to My Dark Vanessa. Of course, I have reviews for both of these if you want to hear additional thoughts about them. These kinds of stories, My Dark Vanessa and Putney, are very valuable for people like me, so I'm happy they exist. But they're also potentially quite painful for the same exact reasons, but still, it's a good thing that they're out there. The other 2 best standalone novels I read this year were, first, The Witch's Heart, written by Genevieve Gornischek. This was also really a surprise for me. I was expecting something along the lines of Circe, like it's going to be a female-centric mythological retelling, and I will be disappointed. But no, not at all. This was a genuinely good mythological retelling, so emotionally impactful, and I cared about the characters, and I snacked avidly on the mythological references. So The Witch's Heart centers on Angrboda, one of Loki's wives, the mother of 3 of the main actors of Ragnarok, so it does also center on the event of Ragnarok, which is a pretty massively important event in Germano-Scandinavian mythology, and it wrecked my heart. Basically. And I did a dual review for this and The Year of the Witching in October as well. And finally, I'm going to mention Under the Skin, written by Michelle Faber. This was not at all planned on my TBR this year. This was a recommendation and also a TBR switch around challenge type thing proposed to me by a very special person in my life. And I really enjoyed it. Was not expecting that at all. It's a strange story. I don't want to spoil at all. I would invite you to check out the review I did for it if you feel so inclined. It's a short tale that packs in a lot of layered theming and a lot of emotion, actually. I also teared up at the end of it, just felt and thought a lot reading it. It really didn't appear so at first that I would get that going into the novel. It deals a lot with alienation, and I'm being a bit cheeky here, but the meat industry, I guess. I'm also going to mention, again, because I did mention it in my December reading wrap-up, the fact that I beta read the very first novel written by this special person I keep mentioning. It was a very, very enjoyable experience for the both of us, and I hope to read the final draft of that first novel next year, and eventually the other books in this person's planned trilogy. This year, I also started doing reviews for other media, so I did a movie review for Dune Part 1, which is the only movie. Is it the only movie I saw this year? Maybe not quite, but it's definitely the only movie I went to see at the movie theatre, and it was a great movie. I definitely look forward to Part 2 whenever it comes out. I also did a review for the TV show Dark. I did a review for season 1 of Foundation, for season 1 of The Wheel of Time, and I also did a couple of video game reviews. I did one for Bloodborne and one for Hollow Knight, and will undoubtedly do a few more in the future. Now I'm just going to give you an idea of my 2022 TBR. There are two big differences with the TBR I had in 2021. One, it will be a shorter TBR. Two, a big chunk of that TBR is basically made out of recommendations from my friend, which is not something I would do normally. I'm very individualistic when it comes to picking out the books I'm going to read, but I trust this person's judgment and this person's taste, so hopefully he will not have led me astray. First, however, I'm going to mention the things I'm going to be rereading next year. I'm going to be rereading the Southern Reach trilogy written by Jeff Vandermeer. I am very much so looking forward to that because it's one of my favorite speculative series of all time. I'll also be rereading The Birthday of the World and Other Stories, written by Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm a Le Guin fan, and that, as far as I remember, is my favorite short story collection written by her. First read this more than 10 years ago now. Series-wise, I am going to force myself to not read series in their entireties, especially if I'm not vibing with the very first entry. I'm really going to work hard on myself to get good at DNFing. So what I'm going to do is going to start a few series next year, and if I like them, I'll continue with them into 2023. So I'm going to start the Books of Babel series with Senlin Ascends, written by Josiah Bancroft. I'm going to start the new series written by Rebecca Roanhorse, Between Earth and Sky, I think the series title is. So the first book in that series is Black Sun. I'll be reading that next year. I'll also be reading Wolf Hall, though I'll probably continue through the entire trilogy. Pretty confident about that one. And I'm going to be reading The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe as well, because Science Fiction Masterworks publishes them into 2 volumes. So each volume comprises 2 of the 4 books in that series. So I'm definitely going to read books 1 and 2. If I really don't like it, I won't continue on with books 3 and 4. Now, in the domain of non-speculative literature, I'm going to mention a few things here already. I'm going to be reading The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I'm going to check out The Silence of the Girls, written by Pat Barker, I think, which is also a mythological retelling that hopefully will work better for me than Circe did. I will be reading Normal People by Sally Rooney. Not at all the kind of book I would have checked out on my own, but again, this is a recommendation from my special friend, so hopefully it works out for me. And finally, in my beloved domain of speculative fiction, I will be reading a couple of novels by Ian M. Banks. I will be reading The Terror by Dan Simmons. This is kind of a double recommendation, actually, because it's been recommended to me by my special friend and by my childhood best friend. So, I mean, I can't go wrong with this, right? And I loved Hyperion, so fingers crossed once again. I'll be reading The Magicians by Lev Grossman. I'm not committing to the actual series, I'm just checking the first one out. I will be reading, as I already mentioned, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, written by Susanna Clarke, and a few new releases as well. Like I said, I'm going to round out the Ambergris trilogy with Finch, which is being reprinted and republished, and I'll be reading Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Did it already come out this year? Because publishing has been a bit wonky because of COVID and the supply chain issues. But so yes, obviously I'm going to be reading more books than those I just mentioned, but a little glimpse at my 2022 TBR there. So that brings me to the end of this long yearly reading wrap-up. 2021 was actually a pretty good reading year overall. A fair few of the things I read this year became all-time favorites, for now in any case. Personal life-wise, it was an interesting year as well. It was a pretty bad year for a lot of it. Then a couple of really nice things happened towards the end. Well, one good thing and one wonderful, amazing thing happened to me, so yay! So I hope that your 2021 wasn't too much of a trash fire, that it was a good reading year especially, and well, hopefully 2022 will be certainly not worse, hopefully better. So on that positive note, shall we say, I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you all relatively soon in another video, probably my January reading wrap-up, and in a couple of reviews towards the tail end of the month in any case. Until then, bye-bye!